Good afternoon. My name is Julie Kaplan, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs at the Center for Jewish History. I'm happy to welcome you today to our virtual space to a discussion about Natalia Aleksian's book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust. The Center for Jewish History is a home for the archival collections of 5 partner institutions: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, the Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Together, these collections create one of the largest archives of the Jewish experience in the world. The collections housed at the center, these, quote, quietly folded and bundled markers of the past, wait for historians to, quote, breathe their dust and see them rise up, making ink on parchment speak, as Michelet, the father of modern history, once wrote. The metaphor, reminding us of historians' critical role in deciphering and interpreting the past, still keeps its power, minus the dust, of course. It is also well suited for today's conversation, as we are celebrating Natalia Aleksian's new book. Our conversation will develop around the legacies of Jewish historians in pre-Holocaust Poland, who wrote both academic and popular history for their community and engaged in creating a sense of Polish Jewish belonging. Natalia will discuss her book with Samuel Kassow. Let me introduce them briefly. Natalia Aleksian is professor of modern Jewish history at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Touro College in New York. She studied Polish and Jewish history in Warsaw, Jerusalem, Oxford, and New York. She published Where To? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950, and co-edited 2 volumes of Polin, Examining Holocaust Memory and Jewish Historiography. She also prepared a critical edition of The Destruction of Zhukiev Jews by Gershon Taffet. Beginning in January 2021, she will be a co-editor-in-chief of Eastern European Jewish Affairs. She is currently a Gerda Henkel Fellow at Imre Kertész Kolleg in Jena, Germany, preparing a volume of Polin devoted to Jewish childhood, children, and child rearing in Eastern Europe, and completing a book on Jewish medical students in East Central Europe. Samuel Kassow is the Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. He is author and editor of numerous books and articles. He served as lead historian for 2 of the 8 galleries in the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. His book, Who Will Write Our History?, was adapted into a documentary movie directed by Roberta Grossman. Before we start, I have 2 important technical notes. First of all, you are welcome to write down your questions for the Q&A portion of our program. To do so, please use the Q&A function visible on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions throughout the program. Second, the program is being recorded and will be available on the Center's YouTube channel soon. We will email you the link to the recording as soon as it's available. And now, without further ado, Natalia Aleksian and Samuel Kassow.
Thank you, Julie. And I wanted to, first of all, thank the Center for Jewish History for inviting me not once but twice. This was an evening that was supposed to happen in early March and was canceled last minute, just before the city went into pause. And now we're meeting today. The plus is that we're going to be able to talk and have a conversation with people participating from different time zones. And I am especially grateful to those of you who are logging in from Israel. It's really late there. I also wanted to thank especially Małgorzata Bakalarz-de Verger, the head of academic programming at the center, who was the great help and initiator of this meeting, and to thank my publisher, Littmar Library of Jewish Civilization, and in particular the exceptional Connie Weber, Janet Moth, and my copy editor, Laura Macy. I also want to acknowledge friends, teachers, and colleagues whose work inspired my own, and of course, having this conversation with Sam Kassow is a great honor to me because his book, Who Will Write Our History, was very much a part of the dialogue I was having when I was writing my own book. I also very much see this project as part of a conversation about search for a usable Jewish past, as in the title of David Roski's important book, and David Meyer's Reinventing the Jewish Past, though he was looking at German Jewish historians' return to history, and mine focuses on Polish Jewish historians. And last but not least, the recent book, Nancy Sinkoff's From Left to Right, that looks at Lucy Davidovich and her work. She's not per se part of my cohort, but she was in Poland and in conversation with Polish Jewish scholars in the 30s and then later throughout her life. I also want to acknowledge political shift that took place especially in Eastern Europe as I was working on this book, and made, to my surprise, my own work on historians and on writing history strangely relevant, more than I imagined it would be when I was working on it. Suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, the project of inscribing Jews into Polish history and arguing that they're not tolerated guests, but rather that they're at home in Poland, and that their history is part of Polish history, while it is also part of broader discourse on Jewish history as such, became a political project, just as it was a political project in the interwar Poland, in the Second Polish Republic. So it is ultimately a project that traces a political and intellectual project of Polish Jewish historians up to the very tragic and abrupt end with the outbreak of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and looks at the transformation of regional Jewish identity in Eastern Europe, or local Jewish identity, into Polish Jewish identity, creating this usable Polish Jewish past for the largest Jewish community in Europe before the Holocaust, and looks at the project in which history was not just an academic enterprise, but also a part of a public activism on behalf of a minority, in which history was a tool in arguing for Jewish rights as citizens of Poland, but also a tool that was to allow a transformation, a creation of a more inclusive society based on civic identity rather than ethnic identity. So I want to just show you a few slides that give us an insight into this cohort. So this is a cohort of Polish Jews who are educated in Polish and Jewish high schools, but more importantly, at Polish universities, for the most part in Warsaw. You see here just a few of the high school diplomas that are part of student files, and not by accident, these are all women's diplomas, because the appearance of women and the role of women among these historians is something that I didn't expect to discover, and I've found extremely interesting. Some of the members of this cohort that was shaped by academic experience at Polish universities, especially at Warsaw University, are better known. Next. Here you see the diploma in Latin of Emanuel Ringelblum, and the next image is his picture among the cohort of Jewish scholars, better known especially because of Sam Kasov's work, but others are less known, and nevertheless they're part of this group that was creating and participating in Jewish intellectual institutions, not just shaped by Polish academic discourse, but also creating their own. Next. Among those is the Institute of Judaic Studies, created in 1927. You see here a group of students. Again, notice the number of young women at the entrance to what was the building of the institute. Of course, also YIVA, Yiddish Institute, Yiddish Scientific Institute in Vilna, Tachkemoni Rabbinical Seminary. The book has a cover with Meyer Bauerban standing surrounded by his students from Tachkemoni, journals, but also projects that didn't quite have time to be fulfilled, such as creating the central archives of the history of Polish Jews. That was the vision of Hillel Zeidman in Warsaw. But you have a variety of institutions that the minority historians are building in the 20s and 30s. Next. The project starts with a group of scholars, all with their roots in Galicia, the part of Poland that was under Austrian, part of Austro-Hungary, and they are themselves shaped by very particular set of political and cultural circumstances. All of them moved to Warsaw at the beginning of the 20s, and their role is quite crucial for creating a setting in which young Jewish historians came of age and began their work. But their situation is always tenuous. On the one hand, they're part of Polish academia. They are shaped by scholarship of such historians as Stanisław Arnold, Maurycy Handelsman, with whom they study. Next. Here he is in all the university regalia, but also by the context of increasingly a shrinking space of inclusion, including inclusion at the university. Next. Here you see the entrance, a well-known photo of the entrance to Warsaw University with demands for Jewish ghetto and for limiting the number of Jewish students. And indeed, Jewish students who are studying Jewish history at Warsaw University were encountering daily, especially in the 30s, this duality. On the one hand, they had seminars in Jewish history taught by Meyer Bauerban. On the other hand, the violence and the exclusion was quite palpable and visible. There is also a question of to what extent this project of writing Polish Jewish history became accepted as part of Polish academia. I talk in my book about how Polish non-Jewish historians reviewed the work of Jewish historians. Here is a moment of triumph, 2 sessions devoted to Jewish history, which were part of the International Conference of Historical Studies in the summer of 1933, and all the important men of Jewish history writing in the interwar Europe are sitting at this table. But the space is shrinking, and this project is this story is also quite contemporary in a sense that this is a cohort that writes history without academic positions. They are all public historians who really by day work as teachers, as journalists, as communal activists, some of them as rabbis, and by night they write academic history. But those two, public history for the general communal consumption and their work as academic historians, they mesh together. I want to end with a moment of serendipity. If I can ask for the next slide. This is one of the people that I encountered when I was looking at the files of Jewish students studying Jewish history at Warsaw University in the late 20s and 30s. Franciszka Gustawa Wiesenfeld, who wrote her dissertation under Meyer Bauerban. And at the time, I didn't realize that she was in fact the mother of my first Hebrew teacher. In 1937, she made Aliyah from Krakow to then Palestina, to Palestine, changed her name to Tzafrira Azrieli, and for decades taught Jewish history in high schools in northern Israel. And this is something that remains an open question for me. To what extent this project ended with the Holocaust, and to what extent those scholars, those teachers, those authors of school textbooks really continued some of the parts of the conscious history written for Polish Jewry after the war, and to what extent this is a project that still informs scholarship on Eastern European Jewish history today. Thank you.
I want to congratulate Natalia on a very important, a very significant book. And I want to thank the Center for Jewish History for organizing this particular meeting. Natalia's book deals with a very important aspect of the cultural history of East European Jewry, that is the Jewish historians of interwar Poland. Before World War I, thanks to Shimon Dubnov, the center of the study of East European Jewish history was in St. Petersburg. And with the Russian Revolution, that center shifted to Warsaw, and Dubnov's imperial Russian orientation gave way to a new focus on the shared and the fraught relations between Jews and Poles in the Old Commonwealth and after. And Polish and Yiddish, rather than Russian, now became the chief languages of historical research. And Polish Jewish historians were working, at least on the Jewish street, in a very receptive environment. Jews in interwar Poland took a deep interest in their own history. Historical novels, such as Sholem Asch's Kiddush Hashem, about the Khmelnytsky massacres of the 17th century, Opatoshu's In Pejlische Wälder. These were novels that were widely read. Historians like Balaban and Schipper wrote popular articles in the Polish Jewish press in both Polish and Yiddish. Historians were mentors, they were educators, they were even political leaders. There was good reason for this interest. As William Faulkner said in a different context, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Or as I myself heard at Leningrad University back in the 70s, the hardest thing to predict in this country is the past. Polish Jews needed to understand their past in part because Polish Jewry itself, that community itself, was a work in progress. The different Jewish tribes, the Litvaks, the Jews of Congress Poland, the Galicianer, were now back together in one country after having lived for more than a century in different empires. They had to understand each other. They had to work together. History, as Natalia said, was a vital weapon in national self-defense. In the reborn Polish Republic, Polish scholars like Rybarski were publishing big, fat books bolstering nationalist charges that Jews were aliens and parasites, that they had weakened the old Commonwealth and it hastened its conquest by foreign powers, that it was the Jews' fault that Poland did not see the rise of a healthy Polish middle class. So Jewish historians who had no chance of an academic career in Polish universities had to fight back, and they did, to show that Jews were in Poland by right and not by sufferance, that they had built the country, fought its battles, giving Jewish parliamentarians the ammunition they needed to fight for Jewish equal rights. But Jewish historians and their historical research also had a role to play within the Jewish community itself. Polish Jewry between the wars was divided politically and culturally. There were internal Jewish battles, religion versus secularism, Yiddish versus Hebrew, Zionism versus diaspora nationalism. Was the Council of the Four Lands of the old Commonwealth, was this a guardian of national unity, or was this, along with the Kahals, or was this an organ of class exploitation? What accounted for Jewish survival over the centuries? Was it religion, or was it, as Emanuel Ringelblum or Raphael Mahler said, due largely to economic factors? Was Yiddish culture a recent byproduct of political radicalism, or was it rooted in, as a Schipper tried to show, in a centuries-old popular culture? These and other questions were not just historical, they were real, they were actual. And to understand the role of Jewish historians in interwar Poland, we also have to understand that culturally, the interwar period of Polish Jewry is a story of paradoxes. Despite growing anti-Semitism and despite the collapse of traditional assimilationism, more Jews than ever spoke Polish as their first language, while remaining proudly Jewish. Meanwhile, Palestine had displaced Poland as the center of Hebrew culture, but a new Jewish literature and a new Jewish culture, including historiography in the Polish language, was growing very, very quickly. Jewish culture in interwar Poland, though, was not a simple zero-sum game where one language triumphed at the expense of the other. There, as Hona Szmieruk pointed out, there was a polylingual culture, a rich interplay of Yiddish, Polish, and Hebrew. Polish-speaking Jews flocked to the Yiddish theater. They learned the Hebrew language. Yiddish speakers devoured Polish literature, whether in the original or in Yiddish translation. The best-selling Yiddish books were translations from other literatures. The last thing Polish Jews wanted to do was live in a cultural ghetto. In all of this, history was a vector. It was a vector to allow Jews to, on the one hand, connect with their Jewish identity, to connect with their history in the Polish lands, but on the other hand, to understand their lives in a wider context. History also, as Natalia pointed out, offered the key to what might be the key to a Jewish future in Poland, which was the acceptance of a notion of civic Polishness. We'll never know whether this would have happened, but this was something which certainly encouraged the serious study of not just Jewish history, but also Polish history, and the intellectual challenge of finding how the two related to each other. I don't know how long I've spoken, but I will stop here.
Thank you, Sam, so much for adding a whole layer to this discussion. And you might have a list of challenging questions, but I prepared. But I want to connect to something that you mentioned, that is those political battles inside Jewish community. And much has been written about various movements and various parties, and how especially the young generation of Polish Jews coming of age in the Second Polish Republic, these will be people, young people, often studying history. If they were in Polish public schools, they would have, instead of religion for Catholic or Orthodox students, they would have Jewish religion classes that were more often than not classes in in Jewish history, and sometimes with reading from the books by Meyer Bauerban, etc. So there is all these divisions, and seemingly within the same families, the young generation is choosing whether they are Bundists, communists, Zionists, right, left, center, Aguda. At the same time, it seems to me, and it works well with what you said about how history was extremely important and much needed by Polish Jewry, that it seems to me that this project of Polish Jewish history is one of those non-partisan projects. And in fact, in many special cases that I managed to trace, such as a project of writing local history of Jews in Częstochowa, where Bundists and Zionists and members of Aguda worked together, preparing history that was not an academic project, but a public communal history project. And it doesn't necessarily take away from the importance of ideological commitments, especially in the 30s. But I think it contextualizes and complicates a little bit how politics was important, but at the same time, there was in a way a shared political project of Polish Jewry. And I want to also mention something that you started with, and I liked very much the way you phrased it, that this was a community that was in fact a work in progress. And we can see it very much with students who studied Jewish history in Warsaw, who came from all over Poland, but also those that later on would be sending their applications for aspirantur, for the graduate studies program in EVO, including those that apologize that they are not able to apply in Yiddish, but they will, they promise they will learn. So in a way, it's a question whether or not there is Polish Jewry in 1918, and Ezra Mendelsohn many years ago argued that there really isn't Polish Jewry in 1918 beyond a very particular group of Jewish intellectuals, many of them in Galicia or in Warsaw, who have this idea. However, by the end of the interwar period, there is Polish Jewry. There are Jews who think of themselves as parts of Polish Jewish community. And that project of transformation, this making of Polish Jewry, is very much an effect, a result of the work of historians. Not only, but historians and history writing has very much part in this transformation.
Yeah, thanks. I have a number of questions, but I agree with you that there is, I would say there was a tension in the work of Polish Jewish historians. People like Emanuel Ringelblum recognized that tension. The tension between political commitment on the one hand and the struggle for historical objectivity and scholarly honesty on the other. In writing a review of Philip Friedman's work on the Jews of Lodz, Ringelblum said that the historian has to navigate between Scylla and Charybdis. That on the one hand, one might be a fervent member of a political party, as Ringelblum, Mahler, Eisenbach certainly were. On the other hand, there is this sense that the historian is a member, I'm using a term that I use in my book, of a counter profession. And that counter profession has to develop its own rules of conduct, where scholarly honesty comes first. And I think that leads to another point. One of the conceptual frameworks of your very important book is this idea of how does a national minority write its history? especially in conditions of hostility on the part of large sections of the establishment. And I would then raise the issue, and again, going back to Ringelblum here, where Ringelblum said that the job of a historian is not just to write history, and it's not just to publish books, although publishing books are very difficult in those circumstances, as you show. But the job of a historian is also to be a facilitator and an organizer. That the historian has to prepare bibliographies so that people who don't have financial resources can save themselves all kinds of trips and time by finding important sources. A historian should organize seminars, as Ringelblum and Mahler did in the Young Historian Circle. A historian should encourage younger people. A historian should go into little towns and encourage amateurs to write the histories of their own towns, to engage in Landkenntnis, to know the land, to do etchings in cemeteries, to photograph and write about old synagogues. A historian is a catalyst, a community organizer, someone who would serve as a source of encouragement. And I see a kind of, well, I wouldn't say seamless, but I see a continuity between, say, what Ringelblum was saying in the 30s and the organization of the Oyneg Shabbos Archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, bringing together people of different political backgrounds, bringing together religious and secular Jews, Zionists and anti-Zionists, all in a common national mission. I think the idea of this archive, not just as a scholarly activity, but as a communal activity and as a national priority, this came out of this notion that the historian has many roles to play when he or she is part of a beleaguered minority.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I want to follow up on a few points that you said, and then I wonder whether we agree or disagree on counter-profession. But about this tension that you mentioned, that I think is very much explicit. It's not really hidden. Ringelblum and Friedman and Bella Mandelsberg and others write about it, and so do Balaban and Shore in the sort of more popular pieces. That is this function of history as something that is not for internal Jewish consumption only, but is also going to be read, and the desire is that the general Polish public will also read Jewish history, and that experience reading or hearing about Jewish history is going to change people's views. But where does it lead? And so I have this one of the chapters that looks at speeches made in the Polish parliament by Jewish representatives, some of whom were historians, such as Moshe Shor, but some were simply using historical references because history was so much part of Jewish discourse, a Polish Jewish discourse. And so those historical references become very much what we would see today as apologetic references to the past. It's constant references to Jewish participation in Polish struggles for independence during the partitions, not only in the Sejm, but also in other venues. Berek Joselewicz is the much beloved character recalled over and over again as a Jew who was fighting for Poland's independence. how many Jews participated in various uprisings. And in fact, Ringelblum's work on Jews in the Kościuszko insurgency was also accused of taking this claim of Jewish participation too far, with the desire to show to the Polish general public that the Jews are and have been loyal inhabitants, loyal part of the Polish society. And so this tension is very difficult to reconcile. And I was wondering to what extent you think the language, you mentioned the multilingual nature of this cultural production, including the press, if you have seen, especially in the works of Ringelblum, in his work in Yiddish, more sharper portrayal, let's say, of Polish-Jewish relations or anti-Jewish violence in the past, than say in work that would be written in Polish. This is something that I've been still thinking about, to what extent the language creates a slightly different space for expressing this historical tension. And then about the continuity, I absolutely agree. And in fact, of course, Oneg Shabbat is a unique project, but we know that there were attempts to create communal archives, for example, in Lvov, in the ghetto. They just were lost. And then this continuity carries with Philip Friedman and others who create a Central Jewish Historical Commission in Poland after the war. And it's again a platform for working together of survivors who survived under the German occupation, those that returned from the Soviet Union, collecting testimonies, professional historians, amateur historians. A lot of those lines of continuity, I think, the projects become much more understandable if we look at them through the lens of the interwar history writing.
Yeah, I would agree. Absolutely. In terms of language, I'm thinking of Lando Chaika's book, Polska to nie oni, studying Jewish attitude towards Poles in the Polish language Jewish press. Such a study, a comparative study of how Poland is portrayed in the Polish language Jewish press and in the Yiddish language Jewish press, would be very interesting and a very interesting contribution. My guess is, my hunch is, that by and large, this notion of Poland being the land of Mickiewicz, Poland being the land of toleration and liberty and wonderful traditions of religious freedom, Poland the land of refuge. Those are probably more pronounced in the Polish language Jewish press than it would be in the Yiddish language Jewish press, although those themes are still there. One thing I do notice, and this is kind of like a real disjunction, is that when a historian like Ringelblum or Mahler, when they write in the party press, they do not. They're not bashful about using the jargon. I'm not saying that they're calling other historians the pathetic lickspittles of the imperialist bourgeoisie, but sometimes they come close. And their language in historical journals is very, very different. I'm thinking again of a review of Philip Friedman's work in the Arbeiterzeitung of the Linke Polizia, where he's slammed for calling Yiddish a jargon and that kind of thing. So I think they write in one register in the party press and another register in the historical journals.
And I want to follow up. This is something that I found extremely inspiring in your book on Ringelblum. This concept of counter profession, and I think it's very useful because it shows how, again, tenuous the professional situation of minority historians was in interwar Poland. If we are having our wishful thinking moment of projects that would be interesting to see, I would love to see a comparative study of Ukrainian historians writing in interwar Poland, and how their narrative can be seen vis-a-vis the narratives written by Polish Jews. But at the same time, I think that this counter profession is also somewhat misleading because, yes, they don't have a chance to have a position at the university. In fact, they are very lucky if they can get a position at the gymnasium. All these opportunities are shrinking, especially in the 30s, even in a context of public schools. So many of them, such as Ringelblum, such as Friedman, work at Jewish private schools. But at the same time, what I find somewhat misleading is that they are bona fide historians, meaning they do the training, they receive their degrees, they publish in Polish academic journals, including the last issues that didn't come out because of the outbreak of the war. And some of them still find ways to publish academic work with the help of Jewish communities. But the dream, in a way, is to be part of the historical profession, not just minority historians. And the relationship between Ringelblum and Handelsman, I think, in this respect, especially revealing. He's part of a broader a circle of students who are shaped by Handelsman, whom Handelsman helps. There are Jews among them, but there are also Polish non-Jewish historians. So there are, in a way, two angles to this professional situation of Polish Jewish historians.
Yeah, your mention of Handelsman is a wonderful segue to a very important question, a very important issue, which is that if you look at many of the books written about interwar Polish Jewry, look what are the titles? Stopnicka Heller, on the Edge of Destruction. Emanuel Meltzer, the English translation, No Way Out, of a very good book, but that was Leszczynski's Yiddish book, Auf den Rand von Abgrund, On the Edge of the Abyss. And it's as if the whole interwar period is seen through the prism of the Holocaust, and the Polish Jews were trapped and they had no way to go. And this may be true, but the question is, how did it look at the time? And then you see Balaban saying, we've had tough times before, we felt tough things on our own skin, and then things get better. You have historians offering shreds of comfort. Zmigrider, talking on the 75th anniversary of the uprising of 1863 and 1938, saying that whatever is good, whatever is noble, does not die. It always comes back. So again, history telling Jews at a very dark time, don't despair. Things are not as bad as they look. And that then leads me to the issue of Handelsman. Now Handelsman was, of course, he was of Jewish origin. You might say he was murdered because he was of Jewish origin in 1945. He was a fine historian. He also helped found a political party in the late 30s called the Stronnictwo Demokratyczne, the Democratic Party. It was small, it was tiny, but it was like a ray of light for beleaguered Jews. It said that Poland is not the Poland of ethno-nationalism. Poland is a country of civic Polishness, where you could be a Jew, you could be a Ukrainian, but you could find a civic identity within the bosom of the Polish state. And Handelsman explicitly hearkened back to the traditions of the Commonwealth. The question is, and of course, I don't want to get into counterfactuals, but in the atmosphere of 1938, 1939, you could argue the glass was half empty. The violence, the anti-Semitism, the growing marginalization. You could also talk about the green shoots, the formation of this party, the relatively good showing of the PPS in the urban elections in many towns, the ebbing of the boycott. And I'm wondering to what degree there might have been support within Polish academia for this revival of a civic idea of Polishness, which offered really the best hope that Jews had of finding a future in the Polish state.
That is the question of all questions, and I agree with you that it's difficult to read the 30s without knowing what's in store, and that we have historians. You mentioned, this is my favorite anecdote, recalled by one of Balaban's students when he was, after teaching a seminar at Warsaw University, he and his students, all of whom were Jewish students, were approached by right-wing students and insulted. There is one account in which Balaban's head was tipped off his head. And following this incident, the next seminar time that they met, Balaban said what you recalled, which was that there were ups and downs in Jewish history, and this will also come to an end. There will be better times. Now, to what extent he's a professor talking to young, distraught students of his who clearly were traumatized by this encounter, not so much probably for themselves, but that he, as a professor at Warsaw University, was attacked. He also said around the same time that in the later part of the 30s, that Polish Jewry will have the same dramatic challenges as German Jews are facing under Hitler. So this was in conversations with Michael Gelber. So what historians who remembered this inclusive context of coming of age professionally in Galicia, what they thought about the 30s, I think we can't really draw a very clear picture of it. But I agree with you that there were aspects that were hopeful, and Stronnictwo Demokratyczne, this liberal party, although small, had a tremendous number of Polish Jewish intellectuals, and many among activists ended up being righteous among the nations. It's another interesting point of continuity if we look at their trajectories, their biographies in the 30s and then under the German occupation. With the readiness of Polish intellectuals to accept this inclusive civic identity and the Jewish history as part of it, I think that Warsaw in a way was unique. The Department of History that Handelsman to a large extent shaped. He was a professor at renewed Warsaw University since 1915. He was personally bringing to Warsaw scholars from other universities. This is, making of Polish Jewry. There is also making of Polish academia taking place in the 20s and through the 30s. So we don't have necessarily there the kind of incidents that became notorious in other departments, especially in the departments of law and medicine in Warsaw and in other universities. Handelsman himself was threatened with violence, and then there were students who would meet him at the tram stop and would walk him to the university campus to make sure that he was safe. Now, we can look at it, like you said, we can look at it as a half full and half empty. On the one hand, there was a sense that he might be attacked. On the other hand, students themselves organized themselves to protect him. So I think that that tension, just like the tension between writing objective history and writing history that would make the case for Jews as being at home in Poland, as being loyal citizens, as contributing to Poland over the centuries and making Polish cities prosper, etc., etc. This tension, I think, is part of what makes the story so interesting, because we can't resolve it.
Yes, I totally agree. Very well said.
I'm looking at the clock, and Julie, I wonder if this is not a moment we might want to take questions.
Sure, we do have quite a few questions from our audience. Let's see. This one probably has a short answer. Given that so many students of Jewish history in Poland today are non-Jews, I wonder if there were any non-Jewish students studying Jewish history at Warsaw University before 1939.
Not that I know of. I had a moment of euphoria when looking at student files. I thought I came across two Catholic, female Catholic students, but they were actually students of Polish philology rather than Jewish history, interested in Jewish topics, but not students of Jewish history as such. Again, going back to what Sam said, we will never know what would have happened if that seminar continued, if those publications and the conversation about Polish Jewish past continued.
Okay, can you address, and I have no idea how to pronounce this, I'm going to mangle it, Biblioteczka Żydoznawska and their conferences on Jewish history. Was there any response from Jewish historians to this anti-Semitic association for Jewish studies?
Not that I know of. Jewish historians in writing in Polish press, in Polish Jewish press, would certainly sometimes respond to anti-Semitic or what they perceived as a biased historical research. Franciszek Bujak was one of those historians that they were engaging in a discussion, but no, I haven't seen any sustained response to that library.
Okay. How did the subject matter of students of Jewish history change with the election of Hitler and the rise of Nazism to the West? And did NA's subjects shy away from Jewish engagement with the left or not, given the negative association of Jews and communism?
It's a very interesting question. I think that there is a change happening in Poland, political change happening in Poland, especially after 1935, after the death of Piłsudski, although I think that in historiography, much too much is made of 35 as this turning point before which things were quite great. They weren't. So there was a sense of danger and in public statements, Jewish intellectuals would point to the fact that copying or following the example of Nazi German policies and attitudes is against Polish tradition. This is something that I actually meant to also say in conversation with Sam earlier, that one of the strategies for arguing that Jews are at home in Poland, and Poland is a really welcoming place, symbolized by Mickiewicz, Słowacki, etc. There is this pantheon of Polish culture and with which Jews associated themselves. So part of it is that anti-Semitism is really foreign to Poland. And whenever anti-Semitism or violence or attacks against Jews are happening, both in the past and in the present, it is always a foreign influence, Russian, German, Nazi. And so in that sense, there was a very historical response on a part of historians to what was happening to the West.
Mm-hmm. Can Natalia speak more to two issues? A, the gender of the students, the predominance of women, and B, the relationship between public and professional historians.
These are two wonderful topics, and I don't know if I will be allowed to speak as long as I would like to. I wouldn't say predominance of women, but I think that the pictures that I was able to show you at least make women very visible. Now, what we make of it is a question. It was difficult for Jewish students, especially in the 30s, to enter Polish universities. And in fact, there were, in a way, two sets of quotas, two sets of numbers that were limited for women and for Jews. And so if you were a Jewish woman trying to enroll at the university, you in a way faced both challenges at the same time. However, they were not as pronounced in humanities because there was not much of an opportunity for a professional career. And so we see a lot of women enrolled at departments of humanities, in history, in philosophy, in philologies. To what extent this is a new terrain for women becoming professionals, and to what extent these were the departments that they were able to enter, otherwise they would have studied medicine, which in fact was the case with Emanuel Ringelblum. He applied first to study medicine, and only because of numerus clausus reapplied to study history. This is a question, but among those students who studied Jewish history at Warsaw University under Meyer Balaban, there are clearly women who are writing their thesis, MA thesis, with interest in gender. Of course, they don't use the term gender, but if we look at how they write and how they look at sources and what questions they pose, sometimes posing questions that they can't answer, but they note that they would like to write more about women, or that the Jewish sources are not giving them a lot of material to write about the experience of Jewish women in the past. I think there is a phenomenon that is a beginning of a new intellectual interest, and also of Jewish women participating quite prominently in a project of writing communal history. Some mentioned the seminar of young young Jewish historians in Warsaw that Ringelblum and Mahler founded, but there were also women among the founders and among the participants, Bella Mandelsberg, Schildkraut among them. Now, Julie, can you remind me the second question? The public and the relationship between the public and the academic, right?
Where is that question? The relationship between public and professional historians.
My entire argument is that they coexist together, that the same people are engaged in professional historiography, meaning they attempt to write, go to archives, take notes of documents, analyze historical sources, etc., respond to publications in a field of professional history, and these very same people are writing popular articles in the Jewish press, or teaching Jewish history in schools, or actively engaging in promoting ideas about Jewish past as military rabbis serving Jewish soldiers enrolled in the Polish army. So they don't exist as two types of history writing projects. They really are operating together.
Okay. I wonder how these historians compare with the ways contemporary Jewish historians balance politics, explicit or not, and science, quote, as a vocation, as Weber would say.
That's a great question. I think this is some of those tensions that Sam and I mentioned, such as the awareness that one is writing for the general public, right, and at the same time, the sense that one is engaged in reconstructing the past as it was, in objective portrayal of the past. I think this is something that continues, that there are topics such as Jewish violence, such as Jewish Christian or Jewish Gentile or Jewish, you name it, Jewish, Polish Jewish, Jewish Ukrainian, whatever neighbors we have in mind, relations in which there is a very interesting path navigating that sense of being a minority historian, in some academic contexts more than in others. But I think, yes, I think there is some continuity with the questions that these men and women faced.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. If the goal was adapting to Polish nationalism as a minority, what was the response of the Zionists who did not believe in this solution for the Jews?
Well, that's the interesting part, that many of the historians that Sam and I mentioned, such as Emanuel Ringelblum, such as Philip Friedman, such as Moshe Shor and Meir Balaban, they were Zionists. They were participating in Zionist congresses, participating in Zionist organizations, representing their Zionist organizations. Schipper was a member of the Polish parliament on behalf of the Zionist party, so was Shor. So their Zionism was not in a way in conflict with the idea that they were at the same time arguing that Polish Jewry belongs to Poland, as in Jews are at home in Poland, which does not preclude in that sense that you can also argue that the Jews are building Jewish society, Jewish state, future Jewish state in Palestine. But yes, their Zionism was in that sense opened to being engaged in both cultural activities in the diaspora in Poland and looking into the Zionist project in Palestine.
Okay, well, thanks to the audience for those excellent questions. And thank you so much, Natalia Election and Sam Cassow.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Julie.
And thank you to Malgo for organizing the event. And Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Bye-bye. Good night.